I still remember sitting with my mom and dad in our small living room, the smell of popcorn drifting from the kitchen, and the warm glow of a black and white Zenith TV filling the corner. I must have been 8 or 9. My dad sat forward in his chair, brow furrowed, as the news anchor's voice, steady, deliberate, announced that the Soviet Union had just launched something called Sputnik into space. It was October 1957, and though I was just a kid, I could feel it in the room. This was something big. My mom glanced at me, then at the screen, as if silently telling me, "Pay attention, this matters." Back then, the Soviet Union was more an idea than a place to me. It was the backdrop to the Cold War headlines, the villain in the movies, the far-off land that existed somewhere beyond the Iron Curtain. My images of it came from grainy footage and tense spy dramas, gray streets, stone-faced soldiers, and always, somewhere in the shadows, the KGB. But what was it really like? What did it smell like, taste like, feel like to wake up in a Soviet apartment, to walk to a Soviet factory, to shop in a Soviet store? Did they laugh at the same kinds of jokes we did? Did they fall asleep at night thinking about the same small hopes and worries as an ordinary American family? Or was it a completely different world? Over the years, I found myself returning to that question. And tonight, we're going to explore it, not through history books or political speeches, but through something far more personal, an immersive journey. We're going to step through time, drop into the streets of Leningrad in the early 1950s, and live a day, then a year, then a decade in the Soviet Union. We'll see it change through the eyes of people who called it home, and we'll walk alongside them, noticing the details they noticed, feeling the things they felt. But here's the twist. This won't just be their story. This will be our story. I'll be your traveling companion, an American who's going to slip into that world and bring with me the frame of reference of someone who grew up with green lawns, Saturday morning cartoons, and a Sears catalog thick enough to use as a booster seat. We'll compare, we'll contrast, and along the way, we might discover that life on the other side of the Cold War wasn't just about political systems. It was about people, as human as you and me. So before we begin, I want you to get comfortable, wherever you are, on the couch, in bed, sitting back in a favorite chair. Take a moment to settle in. Let your shoulders drop. If you can, dim the lights. Let the world around you fade just a little. If you're listening before bed, maybe pull up that blanket. Just like I used to when my dad would tell me stories about the way things were. Because what we're about to do is a kind of story that works best when you give yourself permission to slow down. No rushing, no checking your phone, no thinking about the to-do list for tomorrow. For the next little while, I want you to be here, with me, in a space where the clock hands turn backward and history becomes something you can almost reach out and touch. Picture this. You're standing in front of a plain wooden door. The paint is chipped, the knob is cold metal. On one side, it's America. Your America, with all the familiar things, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of coffee, the stack of mail on the counter. On the other side, it's, well, we don't know yet. But it's not 2020 or even 1980. It's not Washington or New York. On the other side, it's 1953. and you are about to open that door and step into the Soviet Union. Now, this isn't a Hollywood movie set where everything is staged for drama. This is everyday life, the kind of life no one bothers to put on a postcard. The creak of floorboards in a shared hallway, the faint aroma of cabbage soup drifting from a communal kitchen, the low rumble of a tram passing on the street below, and somewhere out there, the steady churn of a world rebuilding itself after war, trying to find its footing in a system that promised equality but demanded a lot in return. As we walk through, I'll be right there with you. We'll notice how the air feels different, colder, drier. We'll listen to the voices, deep, rolling Russian consonants blending with the clink of dishes and the hiss of a kettle. We'll pay attention to the little things, the fabric of a winter coat, the way people carry their groceries in net bags, the expression on their faces as they glance toward the latest poster announcing the success of the 5-year plan. This is a journey for the senses as much as the mind, and the further we go, the more we'll start to see the parallels, the echoes of our own lives in a place that once seemed so alien. Maybe you'll recognize the warmth of a neighbor offering you tea, the pride in a father's eyes when he brings home fresh bread, the excitement of a child discovering something rare and wonderful, like an orange in the middle of winter. So, if you haven't already, take one last look at the familiar room around you. The next time you open your eyes in this story, you'll be somewhere else entirely, somewhere you've never been, but where, by the end of tonight, you might feel you've lived a lifetime. All right, take a breath, let it out slowly. The room is quiet now. In your mind, step closer to that door. Feel the cool brass of the handle in your palm. On the count of 3, we'll turn it together. 1, 2, 3. The door swings open, and a gust of air meets your face, cold, carrying with it a blend of scents, coal smoke, damp stone, and the faint tang of metal from the tram tracks outside. You step through. The door closes behind you with a soft click. The sound of America fades. You're in Leningrad now. The year is 1953. The streets are damp from a morning drizzle. Stalin is dead, but his presence lingers like the shadow of a giant. And somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle blows, marking the start of another day. You pull your coat tighter, not your own coat, but one borrowed from this new life you've stepped into, and take your first steps down the long hallway of a communal apartment. This is where our story begins. You know, growing up in America during the Cold War, the pictures we had of the Soviet Union were almost like a set of carefully painted backdrops, flat, one-dimensional, and always in shades of gray. On TV news, the streets looked damp and lifeless. In movies, characters trudged through endless snow under a sky the color of dull steel. Somewhere, without fail, there was that shadowy figure in a trench coat, a KGB agent, standing in the corner of the frame like an ominous punctuation mark. It was an image so consistent, so repeated, that it almost became the truth in our minds. I remember sitting in my high school history class, flipping through a textbook photo of Red Square in winter. There were no smiling faces in that picture, just people walking briskly, coats buttoned up tight, eyes down. To a teenager in the Midwest, it looked like a world without laughter. Our teachers talked about shortages, about propaganda, about secret police who could make someone disappear for speaking out of turn. The story was always simple. Their world was controlled, gray, and grim. Ours was free, colorful, and abundant. But as I got older, I began to wonder, was that really the whole story? Could an entire nation, hundreds of millions of people, really live in constant fear, without joy, without color, without the small comforts that make life worth living? History, I've learned, is rarely that simple. It's often layered, contradictory, full of quiet moments that defy the big, loud headlines. And that's why tonight I want to take you somewhere different, not just into the pages of a history book, and not just into the newsreels that defined an era. I want to take you there, inside the homes, down the hallways, into the markets, the classrooms, the parks, the factories. We're going to walk through the Soviet Union, not as spies or journalists, but as neighbors. We'll stand in the kitchen while tea brews on a small gas stove. We'll sit in the living room as a family listens to the radio. We'll hear the creak of old wooden floors, the hum of a radiator in winter, the chatter of people waiting in line for bread. We'll smell the cabbage soup, the leather of worn boots drying near the door, the faint scent of newsprint from a freshly folded Pravda. And here's the twist. You and I aren't just dropping in for a quick visit. We're going to move through time itself, stepping into the Soviet Union decade by decade. We'll see it in the 1950s, just after Stalin's death, when the country was still catching its breath from war and dictatorship. We'll step into the 1960s, when Yuri Gagarin's smile lit up the world from space, and people believed the future could be built with concrete, steel, and science. We'll walk through the 1970s, where leisure resorts and cultural halls promised a different kind of prosperity, and the 1980s, when change began to knock at the door. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Why would I want to wander through a place that was, by all accounts, so restricted? Well, because inside those restrictions, people still lived full, complicated lives. They fell in love. They celebrated birthdays. They told jokes, sometimes even about their own government. They raised children, planted gardens, dreamed about the future. And sometimes they even envied the West, not just for its abundance, but for the simple ease of choice. But in other moments, they pitied us, believing we were the ones trapped by greed, by advertising, by an endless race to consume. So, here's my invitation for you tonight. Don't just listen to this as a history lesson. Listen as if you're there with me. Dim the lights in your room. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. Imagine that somewhere in the corner there's a faint ticking of a clock, the kind of sound that used to fill a quiet evening before the constant buzz of modern life. Close your eyes and let the pictures form. The gray apartment blocks, the snowy streets, the warm kitchen light spilling out onto the landing. We'll start in a cramped communal apartment in 1953. From there, we'll head to a factory floor in Leningrad, where the sound of machines echoes off concrete walls. We'll move to Moscow in the mid-60s, stepping into the joy of finally having a space to call your own. We'll watch children in red pioneer scarves saluting their teachers, then follow them into adulthood under Brezhnev's steady but stagnant rule. We'll join a family dinner in the early 80s, full of laughter and clinking glasses. And finally, we'll feel the undercurrent of change in the late 80s as old certainties begin to crumble. If you stay with me until the end, I think you'll see something important. You'll see that no matter the system, no matter the ideology, daily life is made of the same small, precious things: shared meals, friendships, hopes for our children, a place to call home. And maybe, just maybe, you'll walk away with a new perspective, not just on the Soviet Union, but on your own life. So, are you ready? Then let's take that first step. Let's leave behind the easy stereotypes, the black and white film reels, and step into a world that was every bit as real, as messy, and as human as our own. Let's step back in time. 1953, the year Joseph Stalin's death sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union. For most Americans, that headline would have been read over morning coffee in a warm kitchen, the radio or newspaper, bringing the news in calm, measured tones. But if you had been in the Soviet Union that year, your life wasn't just shaped by the headlines. It was framed by the four walls of a communal apartment, or kommunalka. Imagine it, a hulking, pre-revolutionary building in the heart of Leningrad, the paint on its once grand facade now faded, its ornate moldings crumbling ever so slightly. You walk through a heavy wooden door into a dim hallway lined with hooks for coats and boots left to dry after trudging through the snow. The air smells faintly of cabbage soup and coal dust, a combination so constant it feels like the signature scent of the building. In this kommunalka, your family occupies a single room. One room, that's your living room, your bedroom, your dining room, and if the kids are small, even your playroom. The walls are thin enough that you can hear the cough of the neighbor next door, the scrape of a chair across the floorboards above. Privacy? Almost non-existent. When you speak in hushed tones, it's not for secrecy. It's just habit, a learned rhythm of life when everyone shares the same air. The kitchen is a narrow, bustling artery of the building, shared by 6 or 7 families. Each family claims a shelf in the communal pantry and a section of the long wooden counter. There's one stove, gas if you're lucky, and the scent of someone's frying onions mingles with another pot of boiling potatoes. You learn to navigate the subtle diplomacy of kitchen politics. Don't take too long at the stove in the morning rush. Don't accidentally use someone else's tea leaves. And for heaven's sake, clean your dishes before you go. The bathroom? That's another negotiation. One toilet for everyone on the floor, a single bathtub used in carefully timed rotations. Hot water is a luxury. If you hear it running in the pipes, you move fast. And when it's your turn, you savor the warmth as though it's a holiday in itself. For Americans of the 1950s, the contrast couldn't be sharper. Across the ocean, the post-war boom had ushered in an era of suburban expansion. Picture a tidy ranch-style home with a manicured lawn, a white picket fence, and a 2-car garage where a gleaming '53 Chevy Bel Air waits for Sunday drives. Inside, there's a kitchen all to yourself. Linoleum floors, a refrigerator stocked with milk and orange juice, and a brand new electric range that promises cooking with the future. There are bedrooms for the kids, a living room for guests, and a bathroom where you never have to wait your turn. But here's the thing. While the American dream of the era was rooted in space and privacy, life in the Soviet kommunalka fostered something different: intimacy. Neighbors weren't just people who happened to live nearby. They were part of the fabric of your daily life. You celebrated New Year's together in the hallway, pushing a table into the largest room to hold platters of herring salad and stacks of black bread. You kept an ear out for the sound of a neighbor's child crying at night, ready to lend a hand or a piece of chocolate to soothe them. That closeness came with its own set of unspoken rules. Arguments were public. If you clashed over kitchen time, everyone knew about it. But so were triumphs. A son graduating from university, a husband returning safely from military service, a long-awaited letter from a cousin abroad. The joys and sorrows of one family inevitably spilled into the lives of others. Daily routines took on a rhythm dictated by both necessity and habit. In the morning, the hallway would echo with the shuffle of felt boots and the clatter of enamel mugs as people queued for tea. Children darted between rooms, scarves trailing, as mothers barked reminders to bring gloves. Men in heavy coats headed out early for work at the factory or office, lunch tucked in small cloth bundles. Evenings were slower. After supper, often a simple dish of buckwheat kasha or potato soup, families might gather in their own rooms, reading by lamplight or listening to the radio. But the thin walls meant you could also hear your neighbor's music, perhaps a melancholy balalaika tune, or if someone was lucky enough to own a record player, a smuggled Western jazz album played quietly after dark. And while the space was cramped, life was full. Children grew up surrounded by a patchwork of adult influences, uncles and aunts in everything but name. Elderly neighbors became surrogate grandparents, telling stories of the revolution or the siege of Leningrad to any child who would listen. There was always someone to talk to, someone to borrow from, someone to share news with. It wasn't easy, far from it. The lack of privacy could wear you down. The building's plumbing was temperamental, the electricity unreliable, and the winters bit deep even indoors. But in that shared hardship, there was a resilience that bound people together. And perhaps, for all the challenges, there was a richness to that web of connections, a kind of wealth you couldn't measure in square footage. So tonight, as we stand here in this imagined 1953 Leningrad apartment, I want you to feel the uneven floorboards beneath your feet, smell the mingled aromas drifting from the kitchen, and hear the layered chorus of everyday Soviet life. Because in these details, the distance between us and them starts to shrink. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that what makes a place feel like home isn't the space you own. It's the people you share it with. The morning light in Leningrad doesn't so much pour through the windows as it seeps in, filtered through the fog that rolls off the Neva River. You wake to the sound of a factory whistle, sharp, unwavering, and impossible to ignore. It's not just your alarm clock. It's the entire city's cue to rise. Across neighborhoods, workers pull on their heavy coats, lace up their boots, and head into the chill. Your destination, the massive brick-fronted tractor plant that dominates the skyline. The gates loom high, and a guard in a thick wool coat nods you through. Inside, the air is heavy with the scent of machine oil and metal shavings. The floor vibrates under the constant thrum of machinery, a living heartbeat of Soviet industry. Rows upon rows of lathes, drill presses, and conveyor belts stretch into the distance, each manned by a worker in faded overalls, their hands calloused from years of handling steel. Your first stop is the locker room, where you swap your coat for a padded work jacket. The air here is warm, but carries the faint tang of sweat and soap. Men and women alike are tying headscarves, rolling up sleeves, and trading jokes before the shift bell rings. There's a camaraderie here, a sense that no matter the day's challenges, you're in it together. On the assembly line, your station is midway down, a position that demands precision. A single mistake could jam the entire process. The parts arrive in a steady rhythm. Gears, bolts, and chassis components, all coated in a fine layer of factory dust. Your job is to align and secure them before they move on to the next station. It's repetitive, yes, but there's a quiet pride in knowing that every finished tractor rolling out of here will plow the fields that feed millions. During your short morning break, you head to the canteen. The room is filled with the clatter of metal trays and the murmur of voices. Today's menu: steaming bowls of buckwheat kasha, thick slices of rye bread, and tea so strong it leaves a faint bitterness on your tongue. You sit at a table with fellow workers, swapping stories about home repairs, children's school achievements, or the latest rumors about a shipment of fresh fruit arriving at the market. In this space, the outside world fades. Politics and shortages take a back seat to the human need for connection. Comparing it to an American post-war factory, the differences are immediate. Back home, assembly lines gleam under fluorescent lights, safety posters hang on the walls, and coffee flows endlessly from break room percolators. There's more automation, fewer workers per machine, and an almost clinical efficiency. But there's also a faster pace, a constant push for higher quotas, and a sharper divide between management and labor. Here in Leningrad, the work is slower, heavier, and more manual, but the sense of collective purpose is palpable. The shift continues into the afternoon. Your muscles ache from lifting and tightening, and the constant noise becomes a dull roar in your ears. Yet there's a rhythm to it, a strange meditative state where your hands work almost on their own. Every so often, a supervisor walks by, clipboard in hand, nodding approval or offering a quick correction. The hierarchy exists, but it feels less distant than in many American plants. Supervisors eat in the same canteen, ride the same trams, and share the same complaints about the weather. By late afternoon, the final tractors of the day roll off the line. They're painted a deep Soviet red, their metal bodies still warm from the assembly process. Workers pause to admire them, wiping hands on their overalls. Knowing each machine will soon be out in the fields, a testament to their labor. There's a small ceremony for a milestone tractor, number 10,000 from this plant. Speeches are made, a ribbon is cut, and someone produces a bottle of vodka for a celebratory toast. As the whistle blows again, signaling the end of the shift, the exodus begins. You step outside into the crisp evening air, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. The streets are alive with chatter as workers stream toward the tram stops. You can still feel the vibration of the factory floor in your bones, a reminder of the day's work. On the tram ride home, you watch the city slide by, the frozen canals, the street vendors packing up their goods, the faint glow of shop windows. You think about the similarities between this life and the one you knew in America. Different machines, different slogans, different political systems, but the same tired shoulders, The same quiet satisfaction of a job done well. The same small rituals that get you through each day. Back in your communal apartment, the smells of dinner greet you. Cabbage soup simmering on a neighbor's stove, fresh bread cooling on the counter. You hang your coat, wash the grease from your hands, and settle into the evening. Tomorrow, the whistle will blow again, and you'll return to the factory floor. But for now, you savor the stillness, the warmth of home, and the knowledge that across the world, someone else is ending their workday in almost the exact same way. And maybe, just maybe, you start to wonder how different we really are. The rhythmic clang of metal was more than just a soundtrack to the day. It was a pulse, a heartbeat that every worker in the Leningrad plant could feel in their bones. If you closed your eyes, you could almost map the factory floor by the soundscape alone. The deep, resonant thud of a press shaping raw steel, the staccato hiss of steam escaping from valves, the low hum of conversation in between bursts of activity. In winter, that steam hung in the air, wrapping itself around workers like a ghostly shawl, carrying with it the metallic tang of hot iron. Break times were short, but precious. Some workers would gather near the tall, grime-streaked windows, where pale daylight struggled to enter. They'd unwrap simple lunches, thick slices of black bread, a smear of butter, perhaps a wedge of hard cheese if they were lucky. The bread was dense, chewy, and slightly sour, the kind that filled your stomach quickly. There was an unspoken ritual to these moments, sharing a thermos of hot tea poured into dented enamel cups, the heat radiating through cold, numbed fingers. In those brief pauses, the laughter felt freer, the conversations warmer, as though the steam from the tea carried not just warmth, but a bit of hope. Outside Saudisia, the streets of Leningrad bustled in their own way. Trams rattled past rows of apartment blocks, their tracks cutting through snow that had turned to slush under countless boots. Street vendors sold roasted sunflower seeds in paper cones, the smell mingling with the faint aroma of diesel and wet wool. Workers heading home carried their lunch pails, their shoulders hunched against the wind, the day's fatigue etched into every movement. Back in America, a factory day ended differently. The parking lot would fill with the glint of chrome bumpers as Chevrolets and Fords pulled out, radios tuned to the latest hits. A quick stop at a diner or drive-in wasn't unusual, grabbing a burger and a milkshake before heading home. The air smelled of gasoline and fried onions, and there was always a hum of optimism, of leisure waiting just around the corner, where Soviet workers walked home or took public transport. Their American counterparts often drove straight into a garage attached to a tidy suburban house where the porch light was already on. And yet, despite these contrasts, there was a shared truth, the pride in a job well done. In Leningrad, a newly assembled tractor rolling off the line was greeted with a quiet nod or a pat on the steel flank, a recognition that this machine would till fields, feed families, and move the nation forward. In America, a gleaming car leaving the assembly line might earn a cheer, a photo, maybe even a celebratory handshake. Different tools, different economies, but the same deep-rooted connection between labor and purpose. As the day drew to a close in Leningrad, the factory floor slowly emptied. The clangs grew fewer, the air cleared, and the great doors opened to let the last shifts spill out into the cold. Somewhere in the distance, a street musician played a melancholy tune on an accordion, the notes carrying through the frosty air like fragments of a story. Workers wrapped their scarves tighter, their breath fogging the night, already thinking about the warmth of home, the smell of soup on the stove, the sound of a familiar voice waiting for them. And if you were to stand there between the plant and the tram stop, watching these men and women melt into the city, you might notice something quietly universal. The tired smile that comes when the hardest part of the day is over, and the small anticipation of the life that exists outside the factory gates. When the train finally pulled into Moscow's Leningradsky station, the air felt different, sharper, more electric, as if the entire city was breathing in and out at a quicker pace. The platform was a blur of fur hats, wool coats, and the muffled shuffle of boots over ice-dusted concrete. Somewhere far above, loudspeakers cracked with announcements, their echoes bouncing off the vast metal arches. Stepping off that train after years in Leningrad's communal living was like stepping into another chapter. Moscow had a presence that wrapped around you, an unspoken confidence. It wasn't just the capital of the Soviet Union. It was the political heart, the cultural engine, the place where history was constantly being written. And here, I wasn't just visiting. I was moving into my very own apartment. Now, apartment might be a generous word by American standards. It wasn't spacious. It didn't have central air or plush carpet, and the kitchen was barely the size of a closet. But to someone who had spent years sharing a hallway bathroom with 3 other families, opening the door to a space that was all mine felt like crossing the finish line of a marathon. The walls smelled faintly of fresh paint, the kind that still left a slight tang in your throat. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a yellowish glow. The windows looked out over a frozen courtyard, where children in puffy coats chased each other around snow mounds, their laughter carrying up to the 3rd floor. There was a little balcony, just wide enough for 2 chairs, the metal railing cold under my fingers. If you've ever seen a young American couple on the day they close on their first house in the suburbs, you'll know the feeling. That mix of pride and disbelief, the sudden urge to rearrange furniture you don't even own yet. The mental list of things we'll fix someday that you know you'll never get to. In the States, you might walk through the front door with your new keys, drop your bags, and test the kitchen faucet just because you can. In Moscow, I walked in, set down my one battered suitcase, and pressed my palm flat against the wall as if to claim it. That's when the light switch incident happened. I'd spent my whole life in places where the switches were by the door, right at shoulder height, easy to flick on without looking. But here, I found myself patting the wall like I was searching for a hidden safe. The switch, it turned out, was mounted low, hip height, and not a switch at all, but a round Bakelite knob you twisted. When the bulb finally clicked to life, it buzzed faintly, like it wasn't entirely sure it wanted to cooperate. I laughed out loud, the sound bouncing off the bare walls. That first night, I unpacked slowly, not because I had much, but because every item felt like it deserved a moment. My chipped enamel mug on the shelf, the wool blanket folded at the foot of the bed, a framed photo of my parents in front of the Zenith television back in the States, both of them grinning like they'd just won the lottery. Outside, Moscow hummed. Streetcars clanged past, their lights cutting through the winter dark. Somewhere in the distance, a street band played an accordion tune that seemed to weave in and out of the city's pulse. The air through the cracked window was icy and bracing, carrying with it the scent of diesel, snow, and something faintly sweet, maybe roasted chestnuts from a vendor down the block. Over the next few weeks, I learned the rhythms of this new life. The grocery shop down the street where you queued for bread. The small produce kiosk run by a woman who always tucked an extra onion into my bag, for luck. The communal warmth of neighbors who knocked just to share a plate of piroshki hot from the oven. Even though I was finally living alone, the city had a way of making sure you were never really isolated. And then there were the contrasts I couldn't stop noticing. In America, getting a new home often meant throwing a housewarming party, friends bringing over bottles of wine, neighbors dropping by with casseroles. In Moscow, the celebration was quieter, more intimate. A single friend came by with a small jar of homemade jam, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine. We sat on the floor because I had no chairs yet, eating bread with jam and sipping tea, our breath visible in the cool air because the radiators were only just beginning to work. In the evenings, I'd sometimes just stand by the balcony door, watching the life of the courtyard unfold below. Children skating in sloppy figure eights, teenagers in thick scarves whispering in corners, older men stomping their feet for warmth, cigarette tips glowing in the dark. It was the kind of view that reminded you that every building, no matter how gray or imposing from the outside, was a hive of small, ordinary moments. Looking back, the move from Leningrad to Moscow wasn't just about geography. It was a shift in mindset. In Leningrad, life was shaped by the rules of sharing, space, resources, even privacy. In Moscow, I began to feel the edges of my own independence. It wasn't complete freedom, but it was the closest thing to it I'd known in the Soviet Union. Still, old habits die hard. For weeks, I caught myself locking the bathroom door, even though no one else lived there. I found I missed the accidental conversations in the hallway, the way someone would knock just to borrow a spoon and stay for an hour. Independence, I realized, was both a gift and a quiet kind of loneliness. One evening, as I was figuring out how to make the stubborn Soviet oven heat evenly, a letter arrived from an old friend back in Leningrad. Inside was a photograph of their family standing in their communal kitchen, all of them smiling as if to say, "We're still here, and we're still us." I pinned it to the wall above my little table, a reminder that home isn't always about square footage. It's about the life that fills it. That winter, Moscow wrapped itself around me in layers. The sharp cold that reddened your cheeks, the steam of tea rising from a chipped cup, the sound of boots clicking across the lobby tiles. Every day was a new puzzle, a mix of small frustrations and small victories. And with each passing week, I felt myself settling, not just into the apartment, but into the idea that this chapter of my life would shape me as much as any before it. And somewhere in the midst of all that, between the light switches, the balcony views, and the quiet dinners, I met Natasha. At the time, she was just a neighbor's niece stopping by to drop something off. I didn't know then that her teenage world, full of pioneer ceremonies and schoolyard games, would soon pull me into a whole new understanding of what it meant to grow up in the Soviet Union. But that's a story for the next part. If you'd asked Natasha to describe her school years, she would have probably smiled, tilted her head just a little, and said, "It was the best of times, and the busiest of times." Her childhood in Moscow had already been shaped by the stability of her parents' new apartment, but now, as she stepped into her teenage years, another world awaited her, the world of Soviet education. The school building itself stood like a proud, aging sentinel at the corner of a quiet street. Built in the 1950s, it had that familiar Soviet architecture, functional, symmetrical, and serious. Tall, narrow windows let in just enough daylight to cast long slants across the worn wooden floors. You could almost smell the mix of chalk dust and floor polish from the moment you walked in. Every hallway echoed faintly. Footsteps, laughter, the stern tap of a teacher's shoes. Mornings began in a way that would have felt both foreign and oddly familiar to an American student. Before the first lesson, students lined up in neat rows in the assembly hall. At the front hung a red banner with the golden hammer and sickle. On the wall beside it, a portrait of Lenin gazed down. The school principal would step up, clear his throat, and offer a brief reminder of the week's values: diligence, discipline, and loyalty to the motherland. Then, together, the students would sing the Soviet anthem. The melody was stirring, almost like a lullaby that was also a marching song. For Natasha, the highlight of these mornings wasn't the anthem itself, but the moment that followed, the rituals of the Pioneer Organization. The Pioneers were the Soviet answer to the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, though with a distinct ideological bend. Natasha, like every other child her age, wore the crisp white blouse, dark skirt, and the iconic red neckerchief, carefully tied just so. On special days, older students would hand out awards, badges for academic excellence, community service, or sports victories. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it had a steady, reassuring warmth. In America, my own teenage mornings had a rhythm too, though one painted in different colors. We'd shuffle into homeroom, half awake, recite the Pledge of Allegiance, hand over any late homework, and gossip about the big game on Friday night. Our flag was red, white, and blue. Theirs was red and gold. But standing there in that Moscow school assembly, you could sense that the emotional undercurrent, the shared belonging, the quiet pride wasn't so different. Classes began promptly, the sound of the bell a clear, metallic chime that rang through the building. Natasha's favorite subject was literature. Her teacher, a tall woman with a perpetual coffee cup in hand, spoke with a voice that seemed to lift each word and set it gently into the air. They read Pushkin, Tolstoy, and Chekhov, stories of love, honor, and the complex dance of fate. In the margins of her notebook, Natasha doodled little flowers. Sometimes even an outline of her dreams, perhaps becoming a writer herself someday. Science classes had their own magic. The chemistry lab smelled faintly of vinegar and metal. Glass beakers and Bunsen burners sat neatly on the shelves, and the occasional pop or hiss of an experiment gone slightly wrong would send giggles through the room. Natasha once recalled the thrill of turning a clear liquid into a cloudy swirl with just a drop of some mysterious solution, as if she had discovered a secret known only to the universe. And then there was physical education. In the gymnasium, sunlight streamed through high windows, falling onto rows of parallel bars and climbing ropes. The PE teacher barked out orders with military precision, stopwatch in hand. Natasha preferred the running exercises to the rope climbs, but she approached each with the same quiet determination. On warmer days, they'd go outside to play volleyball on the cracked asphalt court, the net sagging slightly in the middle. Lunchtime offered a brief escape from the rigor. The school cafeteria was a wide, bright room where the scent of cabbage soup, rye bread, and sweet tea filled the air. Natasha and her friends would sit together at the same table, talking about homework, music, or the latest television program. Sometimes they'd swap parts of their lunches, a hard candy for a piece of bread, or a slice of apple pie for an extra spoonful of compote. After lunch came the pioneer activities. They might organize a charity drive, help clean up the local park, or rehearse for a school performance. Natasha enjoyed the sense of purpose, though she admitted years later that some of it felt a bit like being part of a play, where everyone knows their lines. Still, the friendships she built during those afternoons became the backbone of her teenage years. Back in the States, I remembered my own after-school rituals, football practice under the fading sun, or working part-time at the corner store to save up for a used car. Our activities were different, but the underlying story, the search for identity, the weaving of community, was universal. One winter, Natasha's school organized a trip to the countryside for a pioneer camp. It was meant to teach teamwork and self-reliance. The camp was nestled among pine trees, with wooden cabins and a frozen lake nearby. Mornings started with group exercises in the cold air, followed by classes or games. At night, they'd gather around a fire, singing songs and sharing stories. Natasha later said those evenings were when she first felt the pull of something larger, the sense that her life was a thread in a much bigger tapestry. By the time she reached her final years of school, Natasha had grown into a confident young woman. She'd taken on leadership roles in the pioneer organization, mentored younger students, and even started writing for the school newspaper. Graduation loomed on the horizon, but so did a future she couldn't yet define. Would she study literature at university? Would she follow in her father's footsteps into engineering? The possibilities felt as wide as the Russian sky. As I think about it now, I realize how parallel our lives might have run if geography had placed us in the same classroom. The desks, the chalkboards, the nervous anticipation before a big test, those things belong to students everywhere. What changes is the backdrop, the anthem, the flag on the wall. But the heartbeat of adolescence, the mix of curiosity, ambition, and uncertainty, is constant. And that's where her story, and the story of Soviet youth at large, meets ours. It's in the friendships forged in schoolyards, the lessons that shape our minds, and the moments when we first begin to imagine the lives we might lead. That bridge, from youthful dreams to adult realities, is where we'll step next, into the world of grown-up responsibilities, in the Soviet Union of the Brezhnev years. I remember the first time Natasha invited me to join her and her colleagues for a holiday at one of the Black Sea resorts. The train ride was long. The compartments warm with the smell of packed lunches, boiled eggs, dark rye bread, and the occasional contraband orange. People swapped stories over tea in glass holders, laughter punctuated by the rhythmic clack of the wheels. In America, we'd drive down to Florida in a station wagon, windows down, AM radio humming. Here, the journey itself was a social event, a shared adventure before the vacation had even begun. The resort in Yalta looked almost like something out of a 1960s travel brochure. White concrete buildings against a backdrop of turquoise water, flower beds meticulously kept, and a loudspeaker gently playing Soviet pop songs. It was less private getaway and more collective celebration. You ate at the same canteen with everyone else, queued up for your portion of beet salad and borscht, and went to evening dances in the same open-air pavilion. There were no tiki bars or beachfront cabanas like Miami, but there was a certain unspoken camaraderie in knowing that everyone here had earned this week through the same slow grind at the factory or office. Leisure time in the Brezhnev years was carefully organized, like so much else in Soviet life. If you wanted to take a trip, you went through your workplace's trade union committee. They decided when you could go, where you could go, and often even with whom you'd travel. It wasn't the pick a date and book a flight freedom I was used to in the U.S., but it did make vacations accessible to more people. Even those who couldn't afford much could count on at least one trip to a sanatorium or resort every few years. Back in the city, culture was everywhere, though always within certain boundaries. Theaters were packed, not just because people loved performances, but because tickets were affordable. A night at the Bolshoi Ballet cost less than a dinner out in New York. I went with Natasha once to see Swan Lake, and I remember sitting there, amazed not just at the dancers, but at the sheer reverence in the audience. No one checked their watch, no one unwrapped candy noisily. It was an act of collective focus. In America, Broadway had the glitz, the big lights, but here there was this quiet, almost spiritual devotion to the art. Music was another thing. American hits trickled in through contraband vinyl and faint radio signals from Voice of America. But the big names in the Soviet Union, Alla Pugacheva, Sofia Rotaru, had a kind of cultural presence I could only compare to Elvis or Sinatra. Their songs weren't just entertainment. They were woven into weddings, summer picnics, and even political rallies. I'd hear the same tune at a formal event, and later that evening, hummed by a janitor cleaning the metro station. Shopping, though, that was its own saga. There were stores, yes, but you didn't just drop in and expect to find what you wanted. A trip to Gum, the grand department store on Red Square, was as much about chance as it was about choice. You might stand in line for an hour and leave with a pair of Hungarian shoes 2 sizes too big, simply because they were there. And you took them, because who knew when they'd come back? It made me think about walking through Macy's back home, casually ignoring entire racks of clothes because they weren't quite my style. Here, scarcity shaped desire in ways I'd never experienced. Sometimes the allocation system worked in your favor. If you had good connections, or if your workplace had special access, you might come home with treasures, imported chocolate, real denim jeans, or the rare citrus fruit in winter. Natasha's uncle worked in a ministry, and one year he got hold of a bottle of French cognac. We all treated it like gold, sipping it in tiny amounts at New Year's, as if each drop held a piece of Paris. Brezhnev's era had its own flavor, a kind of steady, predictable rhythm. People joked about the era of stagnation, but for many, that stability was a comfort. You knew what to expect each year. The same parades on Red Square, the same May Day slogans, the same vacation slot, the same shortages. Life moved forward in a slow, deliberate march. In America, the pace always felt faster, full of shifts and surprises. Here, the changes came quietly, like the gradual fading of paint on an old mural. One afternoon, I found myself at a dacha, a small country house, with Natasha's friends. It was midsummer, and the table outside was covered with plates of fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, salted herring, and loaves of black bread. Someone poured tea from a battered kettle, someone else tuned a guitar, and before long the group was singing folk songs. It reminded me of summer evenings back home, sitting on a porch in Georgia or Ohio, the air thick with heat and laughter. Different languages, different melodies, but the same human warmth. What struck me most about adult life here was the blending of the personal with the collective. Work colleagues became vacation companions. Neighbors became family. You celebrated successes together and endured shortages together. In the U.S., we valued independence, privacy, and choice. In the Soviet Union, people learned to navigate life in constant connection with others. Sometimes that was frustrating, but it also meant you were rarely truly alone. I think back to those moments when the day was done, after a long shift, after an evening at the theater, after a gathering at someone's flat. Walking home through streets lit by soft amber lamps, you'd see people chatting at bus stops, couples strolling arm in arm, children still chasing each other in the courtyards. It was a city always alive with small human interactions, even in the quiet hours. And perhaps that was the heart of it. Life under Brezhnev may not have been glamorous, but it was filled with texture, 1,000 small rituals, and shared experiences that stitched the years together. In the U.S., we often measure life by milestones, promotions, purchases, moves. Here, it seemed people measured it by traditions, by the rhythm of familiar events, by the dependable return of the same songs, the same summer fruits, the same holiday train rides. As the 1970s gave way to the early 1980s, some of those patterns would shift. Whispers of change began to circulate, and new tensions would ripple through both the Soviet and American worlds. But for now, in the Brezhnev years, the dance went on, steady, familiar, and shared. And it's on one of those steady evenings, in the soft hum of a Moscow apartment block, that we step into Part 8, where family kitchens and backyards on opposite sides of the world prove that, in the end, laughter sounds the same in any language. I can still smell the kitchen before I even step through the doorway, a mixture of black tea steeping in a chipped porcelain pot, dill and garlic from the salad, and the faint tang of pickled mushrooms opened just for tonight. In a Soviet apartment, the kitchen was more than a place to cook. It was the living room, the conference hall, the comedy stage, and the confession booth. all rolled into one. The table is small, covered in a floral oilcloth that's been wiped so many times the pattern has faded. Plates are arranged in a circle, holding slices of dark rye bread, little towers of salted herring, cold boiled potatoes sprinkled with parsley, and thin slices of kolbasa that had been saved for a special occasion. And tonight, that occasion is nothing more than the simple fact that friends have gathered, which is reason enough. The samovar hisses softly in the corner, ready to refill glass mugs with hot tea. Someone adds a splash of raspberry jam to theirs, stirring slowly before taking a sip. Laughter erupts from the other end of the table, where a friend has just finished telling a joke about the latest shortage at the local shop. The punchline, that they're now selling snow in winter and dust in summer, lands perfectly, and even the grandmother sitting by the window cracks a smile. It's cramped, elbows bump, chairs scrape the linoleum, and someone has to stand half in the hallway because there's no space. But that closeness only makes it warmer. In America, I'm used to backyard BBQs, big open lawns, folding chairs, the smell of burgers and hot dogs sizzling over charcoal, kids darting between the tables, grabbing handfuls of potato chips before disappearing again. Here, the kids are sitting cross-legged on the floor in the next room, playing a board game and sneaking pieces of sugar when they think no one is looking. And yet, the rhythm is the same. In the U.S., it's the pop of a beer can. Here, it's the pop of a jar lid breaking its seal. In America, there's the hum of a radio playing rock or country. Here, a turntable in the living room is spinning a scratchy vinyl of Alla Pugacheva's latest hit. In both worlds, the food might be different, the space might be bigger or smaller, but the laughter, the teasing between old friends, that's universal. As the evening goes on, stories start to turn sentimental. Someone talks about the time they stood in line for hours in the freezing wind to get oranges for New Year's, and how worth it was when they saw their child's face biting into one. Someone else remembers the summer trip to the Black Sea, when the train ride took 2 full days, but the moment they saw the water glinting under the sun, they forgot all about the cramped carriage. I sip my tea, soaking in the scene, and realize that this is the heartbeat of any country, not its parades or its politics, but the small rituals of friendship. In the U.S., I've seen that same heartbeat in the way neighbors gather for a 4th of July cookout, how the smoke from the grill lingers in the warm evening air, and the way stories are retold every year as if they happened yesterday. A small toast is proposed, not to politics, not to leaders, but simply to us, to friendship, to making it through another year together. Glasses clink, tea and vodka alike, and for a moment, time feels suspended. No one is thinking about tomorrow's work shift, or the thin selection at the shop, or the latest news from Moscow. Right now, there's only the golden light from the bare bulb overhead, the warmth of bodies packed close together, and the comfort of knowing you're among your people. The night stretches on. In America, I've seen parties wind down with the quiet strumming of a guitar, or maybe a late-night card game. Here, it's much the same. Someone pulls out a guitar with worn strings, and soft chords fill the room. A familiar folk song begins, and everyone sings along, their voices blending into something both melancholy and beautiful. Even the children join in from the doorway, half asleep but unwilling to miss the ending. When the last song fades, there's a comfortable silence. Someone tops off the tea one last time. The grandmother starts wrapping leftover bread in a cloth, murmuring about not wasting it. Coats are fetched, cheeks are kissed, and promises are made. We'll see each other again soon, even though soon might mean months. I step back into the cool night air, the hallway smelling faintly of cabbage soup and floor polish, and I can't help but think about the parallels. Whether it's a kitchen table in Leningrad or a picnic table in Ohio, these gatherings are the quiet glue of life. The faces change, the dishes change, but the feeling, that deep, grounding warmth of belonging, stays the same. And as I walk away, the laughter still echoing in my mind, I realize that in both worlds, you don't measure wealth by what's in your cupboards, but by who's willing to crowd around your table. I remember the first time I saw Mikhail Gorbachev's face on American TV. The strange birthmark, the careful smile, the sense that maybe, just maybe, something was shifting. Over here, in the States, the news anchors talked about glasnost and perestroika like they were exotic dishes from a foreign menu. Over there, in the Soviet Union, the words were heavier. They carried hope, but also uncertainty, and perhaps even fear. By the late 1980s, you could feel the air change. In Moscow, friends told me, it wasn't that people suddenly spoke freely in the streets, but they did begin to speak a little louder in their kitchens. Conversations that once stayed in whispers found their way into laughter over tea or quiet debates at the park bench. The Cold War, once an unshakable wall of ice, was showing cracks, but no one knew whether they were the beginning of spring or the tremors before a collapse. American news painted the meetings between President Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev like historic theater. In Reykjavik, in Washington, in Moscow, two men sitting across from each other at long tables, translators murmuring, cameras clicking. Here at home, it felt like watching two chess grandmasters circling a final game. In the Soviet Union, the images were different. On state TV, the coverage was more formal, controlled, but still, there was a flicker of something new in the way people watched. The late 80s in the USSR didn't just mean politics, it meant small shifts in everyday life. Western genes began to sneak into the streets of Moscow, not just in suitcases from abroad, but in corner markets where sellers spoke in half-coded phrases. Rock music, long band or hidden underground, began to echo in basements and youth clubs. American pop culture, once filtered and sanitized, started to leak in through cassette tapes and VHS recordings, passed hand to hand. And in return, some Americans were suddenly curious about the people they'd been told were their enemies for 40 years. I remember talking to a friend who lived in Leningrad at the time. She said, "We could feel something was ending, but no one knew if that was good or bad." To her, the Brezhnev years had been predictable, even if they were stagnant. Now, with Gorbachev, there was movement, but movement in which direction? It was like standing in a long, slow queue, only to realize you weren't sure what was being sold at the counter. In the U.S., the mood was cautious optimism. The 1980 Winter Olympics Miracle on Ice was still in our cultural memory. But it felt like the enemy team was changing jerseys. People who had grown up ducking under school desks during nuclear drills were watching world leaders sign arms reduction agreements. Yet, even as hope crept in, the old reflexes didn't disappear overnight. For ordinary Soviet citizens, the changes were both visible and invisible. In the grocery stores, shelves sometimes looked a little fuller, but then, just as quickly, the shortages returned. In some cities, local newspapers began to print stories that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. Small critiques of bureaucracy, stories about environmental issues, even discussions of Stalin's purges. But for every bold step forward, there was still a line you didn't cross, a truth you didn't speak too loudly. In America, my generation was learning to see the USSR as more than a shadow on the map. News programs ran features on Soviet families, school children, even pop singers. There was an effort, cautious but deliberate, to humanize the other side. And perhaps that was the greatest shift, not in policy or economics, but in perception. I imagine walking through Red Square on a cold winter evening in 1988. The snow falls in slow spirals, the Kremlin walls glow under floodlights, and somewhere, faintly, you hear a busker playing an American blues riff on a worn guitar. Across the city, in a small apartment, a family huddles around their TV, watching Gorbachev and Reagan shake hands. No one knows what it will mean in a year, or 5, or 10, but in that moment, it feels like the world is tilting, ever so slightly. For Americans, these moments were broadcast with commentary about a thaw in relations, about the possibility of a new era. But for those living in the USSR, the thaw was not just political. It was personal. It was the cousin who came back from a trip abroad with a pair of Reebok sneakers. It was the neighbor who had suddenly started selling imported chocolates. It was the teenager who taped Madonna posters on their bedroom wall and dared to dream of visiting New York. Still, beneath the warmth of these small openings, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. Could this last? Would the old guard pull back the reins? Would America really see the Soviet Union as an equal partner? Or was this just another act in a long Cold War play? These questions hung in the air like frost. I think about those days now, and I realize that they were not so different from the turning points in any life. You feel the shift before you can name it. You sense the old rhythm slowing, a new one starting up. You hold your breath, caught between the comfort of what you know and the promise, or threat, of what's coming. And in that balance, there's a strange beauty. Whether in Moscow or Minnesota, we all know what it's like to stand on the edge of change. You can feel it in your bones, even if you can't yet see the shape of what's next. As the 80s drew to a close, both nations and the people in them were stepping into a new chapter, one they hadn't read before. And just like in any good story, the most interesting part was yet to come. I've walked the streets of Moscow in winter, felt the crunch of snow under my boots, and I've sat on a porch in Minnesota in the glow of a summer sunset. The languages are different. The rhythms of daily life shift with the seasons and the culture, but the heartbeat feels the same. It's in the laughter that drifts through an open kitchen door, the smell of fresh bread on a table, the quiet comfort of sitting beside someone you trust. When I think back to that boy watching Sputnik on a black and white TV, I realize now that the world was never just us and them. It was always neighbors, friends, families, people chasing joy in small, everyday ways. So, whether your window looks out on Red Square or a cornfield in the Midwest, life is still woven from those tiny, irreplaceable moments that make us human. And that is worth remembering.